the most dangerous. The thing a man can do is make himself small so someone else can feel large. I did it for 11 years. I did it willingly, quietly, and without a single moment of bitterness because I believed that was what love asked of you. I believed that if you chose someone, you chose all of them, the ambition and the coldness and the late nights and the silences at dinner. I believed that love was patient in the way that stone is. Patient, slowly, without fanfare, simply enduring. My name is Daniel Mercer. I am 44 years old. I teach American history at Westland High School in Columbus, Ohio, and I have spent the better part of 2 decades believing that the most important things a man can leave behind are not trophies or titles, but the quiet proof that he showed up every single day for the people who needed him most. This is the story of the day I stopped making myself small. It was a Wednesday, January 14th, 7:42 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I had just finished packing my mother's lunch, a small Tupperware of chicken soup I had made the night before with the wide egg noodles. She liked in exactly 4 crackers on the side. Never 3, never 5, and I was setting it beside her medication on the kitchen counter of her apartment on Granger Avenue, the same apartment she had lived in for 31 years when my phone buzzed with a reminder I had set for myself 3 weeks earlier. Victoria's work anniversary, 11 years at Caldwell & Moore, do something? I stood there in my mother's kitchen for a moment, the soup still warm in my hands, and I thought about what do something meant for a woman like Victoria. Victoria Mercer née Caldwell did not like surprises. She had told me this on our second date at a small Italian place on Fifth Avenue called Rosario's, where the candles were too short and the wine was too warm, and she had laughed exactly once the entire evening, but it was a real laugh, and I had decided then that I would spend my life trying to earn that laugh again. She said I don't like things I haven't planned for Daniel. Surprises feel like ambushes to me, and I had nodded and smiled and thought privately that I would change that about her, that love would soften that edge. It did not. But on January 14th, standing in my mother's kitchen on Granger Avenue, I decided that 11 years of work anniversaries marked with a text, message, and a dinner reservation she usually canceled was enough. I would go to her office. I would bring flowers. She liked white peonies, not roses, never roses. And I would stand in the lobby of Caldwell Moore on the 31st floor of the Hartman Building on Broad Street, and I would remind her that someone in her life still thought she was worth the effort. I told my mother about it while she ate her breakfast. She was 73 years old, my mother, Ruth Mercer, and she had the kind of face that had been beautiful for so long that even age had not quite figured out how to take it from her. She sat at her small kitchen table in her pale yellow robe, both hands wrapped around her coffee mug, and she listened to me the way she always listened, completely without interruption, her eyes steady and warm. "That's a good thing you're doing," she said when I finished. "You think she'll like it?" My mother looked at her coffee for a moment. "Just a moment. I think," she said carefully, "that Victoria is a complicated woman. And I think you have always been patient with that." It was not exactly an answer, but my mother had never been a woman who said unkind things directly. She had always wrapped her concerns in the gentlest possible language. And I had always loved her for it. And I had always, to my own quiet shame, chosen not to hear what she was actually saying. I kissed her forehead at 8:15. I told her I would call her after school. I drove to Westland High, taught 3 periods the Missouri, Compromise the Kansas-Nebraska, Act Bleeding Kansas, and at 12:47 in the afternoon during my lunch break, I drove to a florist on Henderson Road called Petal Stem and bought 11 white peonies, 1 for every year. The woman behind the counter, an older woman with reading glasses, pushed up into silver hair, wrapped them in brown paper and tied them with a thin white ribbon and said, "Someone's lucky." I smiled. I hope she thinks so. I drove to the Hartman Building. I parked on the second level of the garage space 2G, because the elevator from that level opened directly into the lobby, and I would not have to walk through the wind. It was the kind of January cold that did not ask permission. It simply entered you through your coat and your collar and the small space between your glove and your sleeve, and I held the peonies carefully against my chest and rode the elevator up to the 31st floor. The receptionist at Caldwell T. Moore was a young man named, according to his small desk placard, Owen. He looked up when I stepped off the elevator, and there was a brief, professional smile and then a brief professional hesitation. "Can I help you? I'm here to see Victoria Mercer. I'm her husband." Owen's expression did something, small and complicated, that I did not know how to read at the time. Later, I would understand it perfectly. But in that moment, I simply watched him pick up his phone, murmur something, quietly wait, murmur again, and then set the phone down with the particular care of someone who has just been given instructions they did not enjoy receiving. "Mrs. Mercer is in a meeting," he said. "She asked me to let you know she'll be tied up for the rest of the afternoon. I don't mind waiting." Another small hesitation. "She suggested it might be better if you came back another time." I stood there for a moment. 11 white peonies against my chest, the brown paper crinkling slightly in my grip. Could I leave these for her? "Of course," Owen said. "Absolutely." I set the flowers on his desk. I thanked him. I turned and walked back toward the elevator, and as I turned, I glanced the way you glance at things without meaning, to the way your eyes simply moved down the long corridor that led to the senior partner's offices. And I saw the sign. It was not a large sign. It was a standard office door, placard, the kind that slides into a small silver frame mounted at eye level beside every door on that floor. Most of them said things like, "In a meeting," or "Do not disturb," or simply displayed the occupant's name and title. Victoria's said something different. I walked toward it slowly, the way you walk toward something when some part of you already knows what you are going to find and is simply giving the rest of you time to prepare. I stopped in front of her door. I read the 3 words on the placard. I stood there for 4 minutes and 40 seconds. I know this because I was looking at my watch when I started reading it, and I was still looking at my watch when I finally turned and walked away. The 3 words were, "Do not disturb personal conference." That was not what stopped me. What stopped me was the name printed beneath it in the same small, clean font where her own name should have been. It was not Victoria Mercer. The name on that placard was Jonathan Reeves. I knew that name. I knew it the way you know the names of things that exist at the edges of your life, mentioned once or twice at dinner, parties attached to a title never quite given a face. Jonathan Reeves was Victoria's managing partner, her mentor, she had called him in the early years, the man who had seen something in her, who had championed her promotion, who had, according to Victoria, understood her ambition in a way that most people could not. I had shaken his hand once at a company dinner at the Milestone restaurant on Front Street 3 years ago. He was tall, silver-haired, with the particular confidence of a man who had never once in his life been made to feel small. He had shaken my hand and said, "Victoria talks about you," and I had smiled and said, "Good things, I hope," and he had smiled back and said nothing. I thought about that smile now, standing in the corridor of the 31st floor of the Hartman building, my coat still cold from the parking garage, my hands empty where the flowers had been. I did not knock on the door. I want to be clear about that. I did not knock. I did not press my ear against the wood. I did not try the handle. I am not certain exactly what I knew in that moment and what I was simply afraid to confirm. What I know is that I stood in that corridor for 4 minutes and 40 seconds, and then I turned and I walked back to the elevator and I rode it down to the 2nd level of the parking garage, and I sat in my car in space 2G for a long time without starting the engine. The cold came in slowly. I did not cry. I want to say that I did because it would make me seem more human, more immediate, in my grief, but the truth is that I sat in that car with my hands on the steering wheel and felt something that was not quite sadness and not quite anger and not quite anything I had a word for. It was more like the feeling you get when you are reading a book and you suddenly realize 3 chapters from the end that you misunderstood the entire story from the beginning. Not betrayal exactly, recognition. I started the engine at 2:11 p.m. I drove back to Westland High and taught my afternoon periods. The Civil War, Fort Sumter. The first shots fired. I stood at the front of the classroom and talked about how wars do not begin with the first shot. They begin months, sometimes years earlier, in the quiet accumulation of grievances and silences and decisions made in rooms where not everyone is present. My students took notes. I drove to my mother's apartment after school. She opened the door before I knocked. She always heard my car on Granger Avenue. She said it had a particular sound, and she looked at my face for exactly 1 second and then stepped back from the door to let me in without a word. I sat at her kitchen table. She made tea. She did not ask me anything. She set the mug in front of me and sat across from me and waited, and that waiting was the kindest thing anyone had done for me and longer than I could remember. I went to see Victoria today, I said finally. I know my mother said. I can see that. There was a sign on her office door. My mother wrapped both hands around her own mug. What did it say? I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Outside on Granger Avenue a truck passed, slowly, and the kitchen light flickered, once the way it always did when heavy vehicles went by. A small electrical quirk my mother had never had fixed because she said it reminded her that the world was still moving outside. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I looked at my tea. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm going to be careful." My mother nodded slowly. "Careful is good," she said. "Careful means you're thinking." I stayed for dinner. She made pasta the simple kind, just garlic and olive oil, and a little parmesan the way she had made it my entire childhood, and we ate together at her small kitchen table and talked about other things. Her neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, and the ongoing dispute about the parking space. The history documentary she had been watching about the Roman Empire. The way the days were already getting slightly longer, even in January. If you paid attention. I washed the dishes before I left. I kissed her forehead. I told her I would call her tomorrow. She held my hand at the door for a moment longer than usual. "Daniel," she said. "Yeah, you are a good man. Whatever happens next, don't let it make you into something you're not." I drove home. Victoria was already there when I arrived. She was in the kitchen, still in her work, clothes, pouring a glass of wine, and she turned when I came in and said, "You came by the office today, and it was not a question." "I did," I said. "I brought flowers. Owen told me." She took a sip of wine. "I was in a meeting." "I know," I said. "I saw the sign." Something moved across her face. Something small and fast, like a shadow crossing a wall. And then it was gone, and she was Victoria again, composed, certain, unreachable. "Jonathan and I were going over the Harmon account," she said. "It's a complicated file." "I'm sure it is," I said. I hung up my coat. I asked her if she had eaten. She said she had eaten at the office. I said I was going to make a sandwich, and she said, "Okay." And we moved around each other in that kitchen the way we had moved around each other for years, carefully, without collision, without contact. That night, lying in the dark, I stared at the ceiling and thought about 11 white peonies sitting on Owen's desk, slowly opening, in the warmth of the office for a woman who had not come out to receive them. And I thought about Marcus. Welcome to the Dad Chronicles. Get comfortable and remember the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment, hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. Marcus Webb had been my best friend since the 7th grade at Lincoln Middle School, where we had sat next to each other in Mr. Patterson's English class and discovered over the course of one semester that we were both equally terrible at poetry and equally passionate about basketball. We had grown up together, graduated together, been in each other's weddings. He had stood beside me when I married Victoria on a warm September evening at the Botanical Garden on Broad Street, and he had shaken my hand afterward and said quietly so no one else could hear, "You sure about this one, Danny?" I had laughed and told him to stop. He had not laughed back. Marcus was by profession a quiet man. He was also by profession a family law attorney with 17 years of experience in an office on High Street that smelled like old books and fresh coffee. He did not advertise. He did not need to. I called him the next morning at 6:47 a.m., before Victoria was awake, standing in the driveway in the January cold with my phone pressed against my ear and my breath making small clouds in the gray morning air. He picked up on the second ring. "Danny. Marcus." A pause. "How bad?" I told him about the sign. I told him about Jonathan Reeves. I told him about the way Victoria's face had moved in the kitchen, that small fast shadow, and the way she had said complicated file with the particular steadiness of someone who has practiced saying it. Marcus listened without interrupting. This was one of the things I had always loved about him. He understood that some things needed to be said completely before they could be responded to. When I finished, there was a silence. "Okay," he said. "Come see me Thursday. Bring the prenup." She wrote the prenup, Marcus. "I know," he said. "Bring it anyway." I found the prenup on a Thursday evening. 11 years ago, I had signed it at a long conference table in the offices of Caldwell Moore, surrounded by Victoria's colleagues, and her father, Richard Caldwell, who had sat at the head of the table in a charcoal suit and watched me read every page with the particular patience of a man who already knows the outcome of a negotiation. I had read it carefully, or I had believed I was reading it carefully, and I had signed it because Victoria had asked me to, and because I loved her, and because I believed at 33 years old, sitting in that conference room with my name on a Mont Blanc pen that did not belong to me, that love was sufficient protection against every clause and condition that a document could contain. I had kept my copy in a manila folder at the back of the filing cabinet in our home office behind the tax returns and the insurance documents and the warranty cards for appliances we no longer owned. I retrieved it on Wednesday evening while Victoria was at the gym. I sat at the kitchen table and read it again. All 47 pages. I'd missed it the first time. I do not say this with embarrassment. Exactly, though there is some of that. I say it with the particular clarity of a man who has learned too late that documents, written by one party for another party, are not written to protect both parties equally. They are written to protect the party who wrote them. The clause was on page 31, section 7, subsection C, paragraph 4. It was written in the kind of language that is deliberately difficult, long sentences, multiple conditions, references to other sections, but the meaning, when you finally extracted it from the surrounding architecture of legal phrasing, was this: in the event of dissolution of the marriage, any and all assets accumulated during the marriage that could be demonstrated to have originated from the primary income earner's professional activities would revert entirely to that income earner, with the secondary income earner retaining only those assets demonstrably acquired through their own independent financial means. Victoria was the primary income earner. I was the secondary. I had signed a document that, in the event of divorce, left me with my teacher's salary, my 11-year-old Subaru, and whatever remained in the small savings account I had maintained independently since before we married. I sat with that knowledge for a long time. Outside on our street, a neighbor's dog barked twice and then went quiet. I thought about the house on Elmwood Drive, that we had purchased together 8 years ago, that I had painted room by room over 3 successive summers, that I had filled with bookshelves. I built myself from plans I found in a library book that I had maintained and repaired, and loved in the particular way that a man loves a place where he has made his life. The house that, under the terms of the document on page 31, section 7, subsection C, paragraph 4, was not mine. I closed the folder. I poured a glass of water. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard, at the oak tree at the far edge of the yard that had been there long before we arrived and would be there long after. We were gone, and I felt for the first time since, standing in that corridor on the 31st floor, something that was not numbness. It was grief. Quiet, clean, and complete. Not for the house, not for the money, for the version of my life that I had believed I was living, for the man who had stood in that conference room at 33 with a borrowed pen and signed his name to 47 pages because he thought that love made the details irrelevant. I grieved for him, briefly, privately standing at the kitchen window in the dark, and then I put the folder in my bag. Thursday morning, I drove to Marcous's office on High Street at 7:30 a.m. before school, and I sat across from him at his desk, and I put the folder between us, and I watched him read page 31, section 7, subsection C, paragraph 4. He read it twice. He leaned back in his chair. He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses with the expression of a man who has seen this particular species of document before and has never once enjoyed the encounter. "She's good," he said. It was not a compliment. "What does it mean for me?" Marcus took off his glasses. He set them on the desk. He folded his hands. "As written," he said, "it means that in a standard divorce proceeding, you walk away with very little. The house, the investments, the accounts tied to her income, all of it reverts to her. As written," I said. "What about as interpreted?" Marcus looked at me for a moment. That, he said slowly, is exactly the right question. He stood up and went to his bookshelf. Floor to ceiling, every shelf full the books, arranged not alphabetically but by some system that only Marcus understood, and he pulled out a volume and set it on the desk between us and opened it to a page he seemed to know by memory. Section 7, subsection C, he said, is contingent on one condition that Victoria's attorneys may have believed was a formality. He turned the folder to face me and pointed to a line. I had not noticed 4 sentences above the clause buried in the preamble to the subsection. The provisions of this section shall apply exclusively in circumstances where both parties have fulfilled their respective obligations as outlined in the Mutual Fidelity Agreement, Appendix D. I looked up. "Appendix D," Marcus said quietly. "Do you have Appendix D?" I opened the folder. I went through every page. At the very back, behind the signature pages, was a single sheet, half-filled, with text that I had not read on the night I signed because by page 45 I had been tired and the conference room had been warm and Richard Caldwell had been watching me from the head of the table. Appendix D was a mutual fidelity agreement. Standard language. Both parties agreed to remain faithful. In the event of demonstrated infidelity by either party, the provisions of Section 7, subsection C, shall be rendered null and void, and asset division shall proceed according to standard Ohio marital property law. I read it 3 times. I looked at Marcus. "She wrote this," I said. "Her attorneys wrote it," Marcus said, "and they were very confident when they wrote it that it would never be relevant." The room was very quiet. "Marcus," I said, "how do I demonstrate it?" He picked up his pen. He opened his legal pad. Carefully, he said, and patiently, and without saying a single word to Victoria about any of this, I nodded. "One more thing," Marcus said. He looked at me steadily. "Your mother, Ruth, what about her? Her care, her apartment on Granger Avenue. Who pays for it currently?" I frowned. "I do. Have for 3 years. Victoria said it wasn't. I stopped." Marcus waited. "Victoria said it wasn't her responsibility." I finished. Marcus wrote something on his legal pad. He underlined it twice. "Good," he said. "That's good, Danny. I need every record, every payment, every date." I did not ask him why yet, but I would understand in time that Marcus was not just building a divorce case. He was building something else entirely. If you have been listening for a while, do us one quick favor: subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life, and I say that as a man who has lived through grief and illness and the particular loneliness of a marriage that has gone cold, because those weeks required me to be simultaneously two entirely different people. During the day, I was Daniel Mercer, high school history teacher, husband, reliable presence. I made dinner 3 nights a week. I asked Victoria about her cases. I poured her wine when she came home, late, which was often, and I listened. When she talked about the Harmon account, which she mentioned frequently, and I nodded, and said the things a husband says, and I did not once in all of those weeks allow my face to show her what was being constructed quietly and carefully in the office on High Street. At night, after Victoria slept, I sat at the kitchen table with my records. I had kept records of everything. This was not, I want to be clear, a calculated decision made in anticipation of what was coming. It was simply the way I had always been a history teacher's habit, perhaps. The belief that documentation matters, that the details of ordinary life deserve to be preserved, because ordinary life is in the end the only life most of us actually have. I had receipts for every payment I had made toward my mother's apartment on Granger Avenue, 3 years of rent supplements, grocery runs, medication, copays, the new water heater in October, the grab bars I had installed in her bathroom myself on a Saturday afternoon in March because the physical therapist had recommended them, and Victoria had said when I mentioned the cost, "That's a lot for something she probably won't use." My mother used them every single day. I had bank statements. I had canceled checks. I had a small notebook, green cover spiral, bound the kind I used for classroom notes, in which I had written in my own hand the dates and amounts of every expense I had covered for my mother over 37 months, not because I had expected to need it, simply because it was true and truth deserved to be recorded. I spread it all on the kitchen table at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in late January, and I photographed every page with my phone, and I sent the photographs to Marcus in a single organized file with a subject line that said only "everything." He responded at 6 a.m. the next morning. "This is more than enough. Don't touch anything. Don't move any money. Don't change any routines. Call me Friday." I called him Friday. "I need you to do something." Marcus said, "And I need you to do it without asking me why until I'm ready to explain." "Okay, I need you to apply for a transfer, a sabbatical, anything that gives you documented, independent income and activity for the next 6 months." I was quiet for a moment. "The district has a visiting teacher program. Partner schools in 3 other cities. Apply," Marcus said. "Today." Marcus. Danny. His voice was calm, and even the voice he used in courtrooms. "Trust me." I applied that afternoon. I submitted a request for a 1-semester visiting position at Jefferson High School in Cincinnati, citing professional development and curriculum exchange. My principal, a decent man named Howard Briggs, who had known me for 9 years, approved it within 48 hours and wrote me a letter of support that described me as, among other things, a teacher of unusual integrity and consistency. I sent the letter to Marcus. He called me that evening. "Good," he said. "Now I need one more thing." "What?" "I need a private investigator." I had expected this. I had not expected how straightforward it would feel when it arrived, not dramatic, not cinematic, simply a practical step in a practical process, the way you call a plumber. When a pipe breaks, not out of anger at the pipe, but simply because the water needs to stop. "Do you have someone?" I asked. "I do," Marcus said. "Her name is Carol Briggs, no relation to your principal. She is 61 years old. She drives a 10-year-old Honda, and she has never once in 22 years produced evidence that was successfully challenged in an Ohio courtroom. How long will it take?" However long it takes, Marcus said. You don't rush this. You let it develop at its own pace. You continue your life exactly as it is. You make dinner. You pour the wine. You ask about the Harmon account. I almost smiled. And I wait. And you wait, Marcus said. Danny, one more thing. Yeah, your mother's birthday is in March, the 19th. Take her somewhere nice. Somewhere you pay for with your own account. Somewhere with a receipt. A pause. Somewhere Victoria declines to attend. I understood then in a way I had not fully understood before what Marcus was building. It was not simply a divorce case. It was a portrait. A careful, documented, irrefutable portrait of two people and how they had lived, who had shown up and who had not, who had paid and who had declined, who had driven slowly down Granger Avenue on Sunday mornings and who had had dinner plans. He was building the truth, simply the truth, and in the hands of a family court judge in Franklin County, Ohio. The truth, fully documented, was the most devastating thing imaginable. February passed quietly. I taught the Reconstruction era. I taught the Gilded Age. I taught my students about the long, slow processes of history, how the most significant changes are rarely announced, how they accumulate in the background of ordinary life until one day the world looks different and no one can identify the exact moment it changed. Victoria worked late 4 nights out of 5. She mentioned Jonathan Reeves 11 times in February. I counted not obsessively, simply because I was a man who noticed things and wrote them down. I visited my mother every Sunday. We watched her documentary about the Roman Empire, which had moved on to the fall of the Western Empire, and my mother made observations about historical decline that were, I thought, more perceptive than anything I had taught in 3 decades of classrooms. The remarkable thing she said, one Sunday, her hands around her coffee mug, the pale winter light coming through her kitchen window, is that the people living through it didn't know it was falling. They thought it was just Tuesday. I looked at her. They thought everything was fine, she said, right up until it wasn't. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. She turned her hand over and held mine back the way she had held my hand when I was 7 years old and frightened of things I could not name. We sat like that for a while, in her kitchen on Granger Avenue, while the winter light moved slowly across the floor. Carol Briggs delivered her report on March 4th. It was 43 pages long. It was thorough, precise, and entirely without editorial comment dates, times, locations, photographs, documentation. The kind of report that does not argue or persuade, but simply shows with the calm authority of evidence what had been happening and for how long. 18 months. Jonathan Reeves and Victoria had been meeting outside the office for 18 months. The Harmon account was real. It existed. It was a genuine client file, but it had served in addition to its professional function as a remarkably convenient explanation for remarkable number of late evenings and weekend working sessions and dinners at restaurants on the other side of the city where neither of them was likely to encounter anyone they knew. I read the report at Marcus' office on High Street, sitting in the chair across from his desk, and I read all 43 pages without stopping, and when I finished I set it down on the desk, and I looked at the window and I watched a pigeon walk back and forth along the ledge outside with the particular purposeful randomness of pigeons everywhere, and I thought about 11 white peonies on Owen's desk opening slowly in the warmth of an office whose occupant never came to collect them. Danny Marcus said. "I'm fine," I said. "I know you are," he said. "But take a minute anyway." I took a minute. Outside, the pigeon reached the end of the ledge, considered its options, and flew away. "What happens now?" I asked. Marcus opened his desk drawer. He placed a single document on the desk between us. It was not long, 4 pages compared to Victoria's 47, but it was, Marcus explained, considerably more powerful than its length suggested. This, he said, is a petition for dissolution of marriage citing demonstrated violation of Appendix D of your prenuptial agreement rendering Section 7, subsection C null and void under Ohio. Revised Code 3105.171, which governs equitable distribution of marital assets. I looked at the document. In plain language, Marcus said it means the prenup she wrote to protect herself, protects her from nothing, because she broke the one condition that made it valid. The fidelity clause, I said. Her own fidelity clause, Marcus said. Written by her own attorneys. Signed by her own hand. The room was very quiet. There's one more thing, Marcus said. He reached into the folder and produced a second document. Your mother. The 37 months of support payments, the medical expenses, the home modifications. Under Ohio law financial. Contributions made by one spouse to the care of a parent when the other spouse has demonstrably and repeatedly declined to contribute or participate can be factored into equitable distribution as a marital debt owed to the contributing spouse. I stared at him. Victoria's repeated refusal to contribute to Ruth's care, Marcus said, is documented in your records, in your own handwriting with dates. It is also, as it happens, documented in 3 years of your bank statements, which show consistent outflows for your mother's expenses and no corresponding contributions from the joint account. She called it my responsibility, I said. I know, Marcus said. She said that in a text message on November 7th, 2 years ago. You kept the text message. I had kept the text message. I had kept everything. I signed the petition on a Thursday afternoon in early March, 4 days, before my mother's birthday, sitting at Marcus' desk with a pen that belonged to me, and I felt as I signed my name, not the anger I might have, expected not the satisfaction that people imagine you feel in moments like these, but something quieter and more complicated. The feeling of a door closing gently on a room you had loved and lived in and slowly without. Quite noticing outgrown, Marcus filed it that same afternoon. He filed it at the Franklin County Court of Common. Please, Domestic Relations Division at 3:47 p.m. on a Thursday in March, and the clerk stamped it and assigned it a case number and placed it in a queue of other lives being formally, legally, irreversibly reorganized, and that was that. Victoria did not know. She came home that evening to a quiet house and a husband who had made pasta simple, just garlic and olive oil and parmesan, my mother's recipe, and she sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me about a new client the firm was pursuing, and I listened and nodded and poured her wine and asked the questions a husband asks, and she talked for 40 minutes, without once looking at me, the way you look at someone when you believe they know something you have not told them. She did not suspect. This was the thing about Victoria that I had always understood and never quite been able to articulate. She believed, in the deepest and most unexamined part of herself, that she was the most perceptive person in any room she entered. It was not arrogance exactly, or not only arrogance, it was a conviction so fundamental to her sense of herself that it had never been seriously tested. She had always been right about people. She had always read situations correctly. She had always known before others knew how things were going to unfold. She did not know about Marcus. She did not know about Carol Briggs and her 43 pages. She did not know about Appendix D and Ohio. Revised Code 3105.171. She did not know that the prenup she had written to protect herself had become, in the hands of a quiet man on High Street, the precise instrument of her own undoing. She thought it was just Thursday. My mother's birthday was March 19th. I took her to Rosario's on Fifth Avenue, the same small Italian place where Victoria had told me on our second date that she did not like surprises. The candles were still too short. The wine was still slightly warm. The same older woman with reading glasses pushed up into silver hair was behind the hostess stand, and she recognized me, or seemed to, in the way that people in small restaurants sometimes recognize a face without being able to place it. My mother wore her blue dress, the one She saved for occasions, and she had done her hair, and she looked sitting across from me in the candlelight, so entirely and completely herself that I felt something catch in my chest, some combination of love and grief and gratitude that I did not have adequate language for. We ordered the pasta. We ordered a bottle of wine. A real bottle this time, not the glass kind, and I poured for both of us, and we raised our glasses, and my mother said simply to my son, and I said to you, Mom, and we drank. She did not ask me about Victoria. I did not tell her about the petition. We talked about the Roman Empire documentary, which had concluded the previous week with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, and my mother said she had found it unexpectedly moving, not the battles or the politics, but the ordinary people, the bakers and the teachers and the mothers who had simply been living their lives when the world reorganized itself around them. Do you think they were frightened? I asked. My mother considered this seriously the way she considered everything. I think some of them were, she said, and I think some of them were relieved. I think some of them had known for a long time that something was ending, and the ending, when it finally came, felt less like a catastrophe and more like permission. I looked at her across the candle. Permission, I said. To begin again, she said simply, and she picked up her fork and twirled her pasta, with the precise unhurried motion of a woman who has made her peace with most things, and she smiled at me, and I smiled back, and we ate our dinner in the warm candlelit room while outside on Fifth Avenue the March wind moved through the city, and the world continued its long, patient turning. I paid the bill with my own account. I kept the receipt. Victoria received the petition on a Tuesday morning. She received it the way these things are received, not from me, not from Marcus, but from a process server who appeared at the offices of Caldwell and Moore at 9:15 a.m. and asked for Victoria Mercer at the reception desk, and handed her a sealed envelope in the corridor outside the elevator bank in front of three of her colleagues with the particular impersonal efficiency of the law going about its business. I was in my second period class when it happened. We were discussing the progressive era Theodore Roosevelt, the trustbusters. The belief that concentrated power left unchecked eventually destroys the systems that enabled it. My phone on silent in my jacket pocket registered 11 missed calls between 9:17 and 10:43 a.m., all from Victoria. I did not step out to answer them. At 10:44, a 12th call. This one I recognized as the number for Caldwell and Moore's main line, not Victoria's direct line, but the firm's general number, which meant she had asked someone else to call from a different phone, believing, perhaps, that I was screening her specifically. I did not answer that one either. At lunch, I sat in my car in the school parking lot, and I listened to the voicemails in order. The first three were controlled. Victoria's voice at its most professional, clipped and precise, asking me to call her back, saying we needed to talk, saying there had apparently been some kind of misunderstanding that needed to be addressed immediately. The fourth was less controlled. The fifth was where the architecture of her composure began for the first time in 11 years of my knowing her to show its underlying structure, the voice beneath the voice, higher and less, certain the voice of someone who has just discovered that the room they believed they controlled has, without their knowledge or consent, been entirely rearranged. By the 11th voicemail, she was not leaving messages anymore, just calling. I deleted the voicemails. I ate my sandwich. I went back inside and taught the afternoon periods. She was waiting when I came home. She was sitting at the kitchen table, not the couch, not the living room, the kitchen table, which was where we had always had our serious conversations, where the serious conversations of 11 years had been conducted, and the petition was on the table in front of her, and she had clearly read it multiple times because the pages were no longer in their original order, and there were two places where the paper had been pressed flat with such force that it had creased. She looked at me when I came in, and for a moment, just one human moment in 11 years of marriage, I saw something in her face that was not the Victoria I knew. Not the CEO, not the managing partners. Protege, not the woman who had sat across for me at Rosario's and told me she did not like surprises. Something younger and less certain. Something that understood, perhaps. For the first time, the full dimensions of what it had thrown away. I hung up my coat. I set my bag by the door. I walked to the kitchen counter and filled a glass of water and drank half of it, standing there looking out the window at the oak tree in the backyard. And then I turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at her. "You should call your attorney," I said. "Danielle, Victoria." My voice was quiet. Not cold, simply quiet the way the house is quiet after everyone has gone to bed. "Call your attorney." She looked at the petition on the table. She looked at me. "The fidelity clause," she said. Her voice was almost inaudible. "Appendix D," I said. "Page 47. You signed it." The room was very quiet. "I wrote that clause," she said almost to herself. "I know I said." She was silent for a long moment. Then she said, and it was the last thing. She said to me that evening in the voice of someone who has just understood the complete geometry of a situation they believed they had designed, "I didn't think you'd ever read it." I looked at her steadily. I read everything I said, eventually. I picked up my glass of water. I walked to the hallway. I went upstairs. Behind me, I heard her pick up her phone. I heard her dial. I heard her voice, quiet and controlled and very careful, say, "Richard, I need you to call the attorneys. Tonight." The bedroom door closed gently behind me. Not slammed. Gently. The divorce took 4 months. This is faster than most people imagine these things. Go and slower than it feels when you are living. Inside it, when every ordinary Tuesday contains within it the weight of 11 years being carefully, legally, irreversibly sorted into 2 separate piles, and you are still sleeping in the house on Elmwood Drive because the attorneys have agreed that neither party will vacate the marital residence during proceedings, and so you and Victoria move through the same rooms with the careful, practiced distance of 2 people who have said everything that needed to be said and are now simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. We were in those 4 months almost kind to each other. This surprised me. I had expected coldness or hostility or the particular cruelty that people sometimes deploy when they are frightened. But Victoria, once she understood the complete dimensions of what Marcus had built, seemed to arrive at a place that was not quite remorse and not quite acceptance, but something in between, a kind of exhausted clarity, as if the effort of maintaining the architecture of the life she had constructed had finally become more than she was willing to sustain. She stopped mentioning Jonathan Reeves entirely. I did not ask about him. Marcus told me in passing that Jonathan Reeves had retained his own attorney and had submitted a voluntary resignation from Caldwell, more in late March, citing personal reasons. Richard Caldwell. Victoria's father had accepted the resignation without comment. Marcus said this with the particular neutrality of a man, reporting a weather pattern simply. Information neither satisfying nor unsatisfying, simply true. I was in Cincinnati by April. The visiting teacher program had placed me at Jefferson High School as I had requested, and I had found a small apartment on Ludlow Avenue in the Clifton neighborhood, 3rd floor, 2. Windows facing east, a radiator that clicked and hissed through the night like a conversation with itself, and I had moved into it with 2 suitcases, and my green spiral notebook, and the photograph from my mother's kitchen table, the one of the 2 of us at Rosario's on her birthday, taken by the older woman with the reading glasses who had recognized my face without being able to place it. I had asked her to take it on impulse halfway through dinner, and my mother had straightened her blue dress and lifted her chin slightly in the way she did when she was being photographed, and we had leaned together across the small candlelit table, and the woman had set on 3 and taken it, and the result was a photograph in which my mother looked exactly like herself, and I looked for perhaps the first time in several years like myself as well. Not the self who made dinner and poured wine and asked about the Harmon account, but the earlier self, the one who had packed lunches with exactly 4 crackers and driven slowly down Granger Avenue on Sunday mornings and believed without evidence or condition in the simple dignity of showing up. I put the photograph on the windowsill of the apartment on Ludlow Avenue, between the 2 east-facing windows where it caught the morning light. The settlement was finalized on a Friday in late June. Marcus called me at 4:30 p.m. Cincinnati time and told me in the same steady voice he used for everything that the judge had signed the order that the terms were as negotiated, that it was done. The terms were these: the house on Elmwood Drive would be sold and the proceeds divided equally under Ohio's equitable distribution law, the prenup having been rendered void by Victoria's violation of Appendix D, the joint. Investments accumulated over 11 years divided equally. The savings, the retirement accounts, the small portfolio Victoria had maintained in both their names divided equally. Additionally, and this was the part that Marcus had spent 3 months building, toward, with the quiet, methodical patience of a man who understands that the most important arguments are made not in courtrooms but in documents, the court had recognized 37 months of unilateral financial support provided to Ruth Mercer as a marital contribution, deserving of equitable compensation, and had ordered a corresponding adjustment in the final asset distribution. Victoria's prenup, written to protect everything she had built, had protected nothing, because she had broken the one rule she had written herself. I sat with the phone against my ear in my apartment on Ludlow Avenue and looked at the photograph on the windowsill and listened to Marcus explain the numbers, and I did not feel as I had perhaps expected to feel the clean, sharp satisfaction of a verdict going your way. I felt tired, not the bad kind of tired, not the exhausted, hollowed-out tired of those last months in the house on Elmwood Drive, moving through rooms with a woman who was no longer quite my wife and had perhaps not been for longer than I knew. This was a different kind of tired. The tired that comes after something large has been completed. The tired of a man who has carried something heavy for a long time and has finally, in a parking lot on an ordinary Friday afternoon, set it down. Danny Marcus said, "I'm here. You okay?" I looked at the photograph. My mother's blue dress, the candlelight. Her chin lifted slightly. "Yeah," I said. "I think I actually am." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "She called me," he said. "Victoria. Last week. I had not known this." "What did she say?" "She asked me to tell you." He paused. "She said to tell you she was sorry. Not about the legal outcome. About the other things." I was quiet. "She said she knew it didn't change anything." "It doesn't," I said. "No," Marcus said. "But I thought you should know she said it." I thought about the woman who had laughed exactly once on our second date at Rosario's, a real laugh. The laugh I had spent 11 years trying to earn again. I thought about the woman who had told me she did, not like surprises, and had meant it in ways I had not understood at the time. I thought about 11 white peonies opening slowly on Owen's desk in the warmth of a corporate office on the 31st floor of the Hartman building, for a woman who had not come to receive them. "Tell her I heard her," I said. Marcus said he would. We talked for a few more minutes about practical things, the timeline for the house sale, the account, transfers, the final paperwork, and then we said goodbye the way we had said goodbye since the 7th grade, without ceremony, simply, "Thanks, Marcus. Anytime, Danny. That's what I'm here for." The call with my mother was shorter. I called her at 5 p.m., sitting on the floor of my apartment on Ludlow Avenue with my back against the wall below the east-facing windows, the evening light coming in long and warm and golden the way it comes in June through windows that face east in the late afternoon. She picked up on the second ring. "It's done," I said. A pause. Then, "Are you all right?" "Yeah, Mom, I'm all right." Another pause. The familiar sound of her kitchen, the refrigerators. Low hum the clock on the wall, the particular acoustic signature of the apartment on Granger Avenue that I had known my entire life. "Come home soon," she said. "I will. Daniel. Yeah, am proud of you." A pause. Not for the outcome. For how you got there. I pressed the phone against my ear and looked at the evening light on the floor of my apartment and breathed. "I know, Mom," I said. "Thank you." We talked for a few more minutes. She told me Mrs. Kowalski had finally resolved the parking space dispute decisively and in her favor, and that the resolution had involved a strongly worded letter to the building management that my mother considered a masterpiece of the form. I laughed a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere, genuine, and she laughed too, and for a few minutes we were simply a mother and her son talking on the phone in the early evening while the light moved slowly across the floor. After we hung up, I sat there for a while. The radiator clicked and hissed. Outside on Ludlow Avenue, someone was playing music from an open window, something slow and instrumental that I could not identify drifting up from the street in the warm June air, and I sat on the floor of my apartment and listened to it and thought about the long, patient processes of history, about how the most significant changes accumulate quietly in the background of ordinary life until one day the world looks different and you cannot identify the exact moment it changed. I thought about a man standing in a corridor on the 31st floor of a building on Broad Street reading 3 words on a placard beside a door, understanding something in 4 minutes and 40 seconds that had been true for 18 months. I thought about my mother's kitchen on Granger Avenue, the soup with the wide egg noodles and exactly 4 crackers on the side, the coffee mug held in both hands, the kitchen light that flickered when heavy vehicles passed on the street outside, proof that the world was still moving. I thought about how it had not felt like winning. It had felt like what my mother had said at Rosario's in March in the candlelight over the pasta and the wine. Permission. Permission to begin again. The most enduring things a man can build are not made of money or titles or the careful legal architecture of a prenuptial agreement written to protect everything and protect nothing. They are made of soup with exactly 4 crackers, of Sunday mornings on Granger Avenue, of showing up without announcement or expectation, simply because someone you love needs you to be there. I learned this not from a courtroom or a settlement agreement or 47 pages of legal language. I learned it from a woman in a pale yellow robe with both hands around a coffee mug who had never once in my entire life told me anything other than the truth, and who had waited with the patience of someone who understands that some lessons cannot be taught but only lived. For me to finally hear it. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing to the Dad Chronicles for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. I will see you on the next one.